Hello, everyone. I want to talk about some very basic things to introduce existentialism to you. Existentialism is a kind of philosophy that quite a number of you may enjoy. It also can be a little bit tricky because some of the things it has to offer may seem very, subjective and will seem to um, conform to your intuitions and whatnot. But it gets a little bit deeper than that. In Tom Flynn's book, the first chapter is called Philosophy as a Way of Life. And what I want to do in this introductory lecture is just to try to map out what he means by that with a few things. Um, the first distinction that he talks about is a difference between a scientific and a moral truth. Now, that description or those descriptions I'm not very happy with because I think they have a lot of connotations to them. But they do have some merit. Let me try to flesh it out like this. Mostly when people think about what philosophy is and what it's for, we tend to immediately think about things like logic. We tend to think about things like ethics, um, and in particular trying to find some kind of truth to any sort of claim. And most of the time, we want to go through some kind of uh, scientific method of inquiry. So, um, the example that I often give in my classes, which is a little bit outside of philosophy, but it may be helpful. Think about a tree, and what would a scientist say about a tree? All right, well, a tree is this conglomeration of various kinds of cells, various kinds of structures that photosynthesizes light, that um, takes in moisture and mineral from the ground to grow, right? And that would suffice as a definition of a tree. But that's very different than the kind of trees that you and I and nearly everybody lives with. I mean, that's part of the description indeed. But a tree is also something that we plant for shade. Maybe you plant a willow in your yard to suck up the moisture. A tree might be put in places, or trees will be put in places for beauty. Maybe you have a tree that's very special to you growing up that you played on, and so forth. So there are all kinds of different sorts of trees. Now, this will hopefully give some kind of insight into these differences between a scientific truth and a moral, or maybe even better, a personal truth. The scientific tree is this narrow tree that, or narrow understanding of a tree that is described through through quantifiable descriptions. The personal tree is one that is described through uh, qualitative descriptions. Another way of putting this, which some philosophers use this term, would be thick and thin concept, right? So when we think about a thin concept, particularly a thin concept of a person, that would be something like uh, the stripped down person of public interest, right? That would just be this entity that may be endowed with certain rights, that may be counted as a vote or whatnot. Whereas a thick person, the thick concept of a person in the public, would have all other kinds of different qualifications attached to her or him, right? You know, your uh, family structures, your moral interests, your religious background, and all these other things that might come into the conversation that might be important in really defining who and what you are. Um, the uh, the the thin moral concept of a person is the universalist person, right? When we talk about a universal concept, a universal doctrine of rights, a universal doctrine of liberty, those are the things that would apply to that person, right? It disregards the particular things. The thick concept, on the other hand, does take into consideration these particular things, right? your particular background, your particular interest, your drives, personal drives, all these other kind of things. So, now this isn't the heart of existentialism, but this is getting us closer to what it is. And leaving that for a moment, let's go into a few people that Tom Flynn mentions in the beginning, namely Blaise Pascal. And this might be a good person to talk about, and where we'll end this particular lecture. Blaise Pascal was a French philosopher and theologian who was working at the age of the Enlightenment. And for those of you that might be keen on history, you'll remember that the Enlightenment is the great period of rationalism, scientific inquiry, and certainly of revolution. And part of the philosophical doctrine that comes out of the Enlightenment would be things like the universalist person, and more precisely, a major involvement with what we might call rationalism, right? Rationalism being a mode of thinking. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant is a exemplar of this notion of rationalism, right? He says, what is the right thing to do in his ethics? And the right thing to do is um, is always act according to duty, right? Always act according to uh, um, uh, a set moral principle. And it doesn't matter the circumstances, you are always to write that way. And moreover, more interestingly, he says that there is more value in a mean person who acts well out of duty than an otherwise very nice person who just acts nice by inclination, but outside of the concept of duty. Now that should strike you as a little bit strange. It strikes me as strange. But that gives you an idea of a probably a more um, uh, difficult way of getting to this idea of rationalism. Well, Blaise Pascal was very skeptical about that. And one of his famous quotes is, the heart knows reasons for which reason knows not. In other words, he thought that it was doing a disservice to the person to omit these things that are very personal, to omit these things, these drives, these longings, um, these particularities of a person, to toss those out and replace them with a more broad and vague understanding of who and what a person is, such as maybe what this fellow Immanuel Kant might have said, right, regarding the person as just, initially, at least the public person, being someone who is just a sort of a rational frame that acts a certain way in public. Pascal was trying to break down those barriers, if you will, of public and private, and to insist that the person is a much more involved, much more particularized kind of thing. Now, maybe that did not quite get to what you were expecting with existentialism, but as a start, I'm going to leave it there. And the next few lectures we'll be talking about things like the existentialist, and in particular some of the other more broad goals of existentialism. So until next time, thank you, and again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you. Bye-bye.